A quick word about Up First from NPR. Breaking news, as you've probably noticed, is pretty broken. You're constantly doom scrolling on Facebook, TikTok, Twitter, or X, or whatever we're calling it, and maybe you feel a little bit of, I'm over it, I'm over the news. Well, if this sounds like you, I recommend that you listen to the Up First podcast from NPR. You get everything you need to know in an easy 15-minute update. Look, if you listen to this show, it is very likely that you follow the news and you care about politics, just like me. But I think one of the best choices you can make is decide how to engage with the news. And Up First is a perfect way to distill down to just the information you need to help you understand the news without getting overwhelmed and feeling that sense of news paralysis. Up First is national and international. There's facts and information, but there's also personality and analysis. Start your day every day with Up First. Change the way that you consume the news. Listen now to the Up First podcast from NPR. Hello and welcome to This Day in Esoteric Political History from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, February 1973, Chicago Mayor Richard J. Daley orders the immediate end to pay toilets at the city's 3 major airports. This was in the middle of what can be only described as an era of massive reform when it came to the way that Americans used public toilets. Pay toilets had been the norm in lots of the country, but a genuine grassroots movement had advocated for getting rid of pay toilets. And in around 1973 and 1974, justice rolled down like waters swirling through a toilet bowl. I promise listeners that's my only toilet-related pun of this episode. It's going to be very hard to resist, though. We'll see as we have this conversation. But for real, though, the fights over free toilets and pay toilets has a lot to say about the activism and reform of the era. And of course, the question of whether bathrooms should be free continues today. There's public restrooms, and then there's restrooms at places like Starbucks and other chains and restaurants. Starbucks has vowed to start cracking down on their toilet policy. Here to discuss the free toilet fights of the 1970s, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
I'm very fascinated by this story, and I want to start big picture here because... yeah, toilets in this country weren't always free, and toilets around the world aren't always free, right?
No. If you've ever traveled to Europe, you know that you have to put in like a euro, or maybe it's, I can't remember how much it costs, but I remember the first time I went to France, I was shocked. I was like, oh, pay to go to the bathroom?
I thought this was a socialist country.
No, I was so mad.
But then you went in the bathroom and it was pretty nice, right?
Well, yeah, that too. I appreciated that. I was like, oh, okay, it's clean. There's toilet paper. There's like an attendant there sometimes that, you know, like will give you free sanitary napkins or something. But like, I don't know. I this whole battle is interesting to me because I don't think we appreciate just how contested public restrooms have been, how racially divided, not just due gender, but race as well. I mean, when you think about Jim Crow segregation and the idea of like separate water fountains and separate bathrooms and how bathrooms are intimate spaces, you know, in which people are doing very intimate things and people are very protective of those spaces, but also those spaces become highly policed too. There's a whole long history of how we have sort of grappled with our shared norms about public restrooms.
I feel like this is something that came up a lot maybe about 10 years ago. People started sharing more of this history because it's very similar to the segregation bans on public swimming pools. This idea that there are certain spaces that should not be shared because of racist ideas. But it came up again 10 years ago because that's when that big wave of bathroom bans was coming in for trans men and women. And it really, I think that moment really reminded us how impassioned those political fights can be and how that vulnerability can be weaponized around bathrooms.
Absolutely. And how difficult it is to when you don't have access to bathrooms. I mean, if you've ever done a road trip, if you've ever traveled with little children, or just are living your lives because you drink too much coffee, whatever it is, and you've been in a pinch, being able to have quick, clean. I'm going to put the clean on there. Clean restrooms, free restrooms, accessible restrooms is a huge deal.
Yeah, I mean, even more so than, not to justify any segregation, but even more so than swimming pools, restaurants, hotels.
Absolutely.
Like this is
Absolutely.
just like common necessity, and so I think it throws a lot of this into sharper relief. We'll circle back a little bit to that, and certainly there are continue to be bathroom wars right now, and the sort of whole valence around access to bathrooms. But let's go to the early 70s and the specific fight around paid or free toilets. What was the argument for removing the pay in, say, a city like Chicago?
You promised no more puns, Jody.
What was the argument for making it free in a city like Chicago?
So the idea was that paid toilets created a couple of different kinds of barriers for people. For one, there was a gradient of the kinds of public toilets that you had. Urinals often didn't come with any sort of price tag. So this meant that women, when they needed to use the restroom, were always taxed for it, and men were not. So there was a gender inequity problem with that. But this is also an era, sort of a celebration of the public good, right? Like that this is something that all people need, and therefore we shouldn't be charged for it. That this is not a place where consumption needs to be happening. Exchange of cash doesn't need to be happening for people to be able to use toilets. And shouldn't this be something that the city itself takes care of? And so as this sort of argument is building in the 1960s and 70s, before which America had tens of thousands of paid toilets. But as this argument is growing in the 1970s, you start to get the kind of classic 1960s, 1970s social movements.
Yeah.
So a grassroots organization called Septia, the Committee to End Paid Toilets in America, mobilized to start changing the law. They put out a quarterly newsletter called the Free Toilet Paper.
So good. So good.
Love it. You'll be unsurprised to learn that this is for high school students who are founding this.
Right. Well, Septia, though, even just, I mean, it starts with the C, but it has that septic sound to it. It's so good. It's so good. Yeah.
It's fantastic. And they were also like making a serious argument, and they were like breaking down the costs of everything. And they were, teaching you sort of how to have guerrilla visits to the bathroom where you could go in without paying, how you could avoid paying for it. And some 2,000 people signed up for it. Their credo was, as long as people's body functions are restricted just because they do not have a piece of change, there is no true freedom. And that's kind of true, right? Like, I just want to go back to kind of like the point you were making before, Jody, which is that this is a basic human function. Yeah. And actually, using the bathroom outside of a bathroom is often criminalized in cities.
Yes, that's a really good point.
So you don't have an option.
Yeah, you can't just go pee on a tree. No, you really can't. And there's also a dignity aspect to this. I mean, like, 100%. If you're in a pinch, do what you got to do. But, like, if you have the opportunity to have privacy, to use the restroom, like, everybody wants access to that and shouldn't have to. And in the 21st century framework, I don't know about you, but I don't carry change. Like, unless this is going to be like some sort of swipe, Venmo type of cashless entry point into a bathroom. Most people, and this would have been different in the 70s, but the idea of carrying change or always having a quarter or always having a nickel or a dime is not something that we always have access to when we think about the way that we live our lives.
I want to return to this Septia group for a second, not just because I love the acronym and I love the free toilet paper that they did, but there's two things here that I think are worth highlighting. One is, and I think about this a lot, we've talked about this on the show a lot, but I just love this idea of all these people who got sort of politically activated in the 60s, now just like kicking around in the 70s and even into the 80s. And obviously they have their values and they're going to act on their values, but it's just a reminder to me that like activism and social justice and just sort of being in the mix is like a learned behavior. And so they were like, we mixed it up in the 60s in the civil rights movement. Obviously those problems weren't solved, but it's like, okay, what next? Like, let's do some stuff. Let's organize, let's mobilize. And so then, toilets. Okay, great. It's just a reminder that like, I mean, and I saw it with my parents, right? Like they lived a life of activism in part because they had their values, but also because it's just a learned behavior. That's just kind of how you engage with the world, right? And it carried through the 80s into the 90s into today. So that's part of the story that I think about a lot too. And then the other element here is that kind of theater that we've talked about a lot and the sort of parody. And this group is like very comfortable moving back and forth between those two. And even the founders of the group talk about like, well, we kind of maybe started doing this as a bit of a joke, but we always were like, we can actually move this towards actual action and change. And I just think people need to embrace that a lot and be a lot more fluid around that kind of It's not even possible to not make, but people need to be a lot more flexible around those kinds of lines, and that is what happens here, right? I mean, maybe it started as a joke, or maybe it started with the funny acronym first, but it pretty quickly moved towards like convincing the actual elected officials that like, hey, there is an equity issue here, to the point where we get to this moment in the spring of 1973. They remove the airport policy. They say at the airports, okay, public toilets are free. And then they pass ordinance that prohibited payment for all public stalls. And Richard Daley proclaims, the mayor of Chicago, he says he, quote, did it for women's lib, which Richard Daley doesn't strike me as the kind of person who would walk around too much saying, I'm all about women's lib. But hey.
Yeah.
With this one, he was like,
we'll give it to him for this one.
We'll give it to you.
It's low political hanging fruit. I mean, I think this is something a lot of mayors, senators can sort of get on board and say, like, listen, I helped create free bathrooms for the public. I mean, everyone, I think for the most part, I think about the pushback. Like, okay, so who's pushing back on this politically, like saying this is a bad idea? I mean, I suppose there's an argument to be made, but for the most part, I think this is something that people generally want.
I'm David Remnick, host of the New Yorker Radio Hour. There's nothing like finding a story you can really sink into that lets you tune out the noise and focus on what matters. In print or here on the podcast, the New Yorker brings you thoughtfulness and depth and even humor that you can't find anywhere else. So please join me every week for the New Yorker Radio Hour, wherever you listen to podcasts.
This day is brought to you by Quince. Now, who doesn't love the good things in life? And even though I enjoy a little luxury, it doesn't mean I can always afford it. But Quince is here to help. Quince has become my go-to for luxury essentials at affordable prices. I know we're all shivering right now, but I'm already thinking about spring and summer and refreshing my wardrobe a bit. So I'm on the Quince website right now looking at some stuff. Oh, another pair of linen pants. I have a pair of those already, but maybe a different color. There's sunglasses here I'm looking at. An organic cotton silk button-down polo sweater. If you see me rocking that this spring, please compliment it. It's very nice looking. And the best part of it all is that Quince items are priced 50 to 80% less than similar brands. You can get 100% Mongolian cashmere sweaters for $50, shorts, t-shirts. You can even get 14-karat gold jewelry. So now's the time. Treat yourself, restock, look good, give yourself the luxury you deserve with Quince. Go to quince.com/thisday for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. That's QUINCE.com/thisday to get free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/thisday.
And activism, in addition to leading to more different kinds of activism, leads to more of the same kind of activism, because this movement spread across the country. Out in California, a politician named March Fong-u crusaded against pay toilets there. She framed it, as Daley and others did, as a fight against sexism. And Reagan signs in the California ban in 1974. There's activism in New York that leads to the state ban in 1975. So it starts in Chicago, but then it radiates out across the country.
Yeah. I love it that Senator Karen Bernstein is known as the mother of free toilets in the state of New York. Yeah. Quite the title.
And so, you know,
I was about to say, I don't have a nickname yet, so I'm holding out hope that it's toilet related somehow.
Mother of free toilets. The fight, you know, this continues today. We should get to that in a second. I do want to ask about one element to this, which is, you know, I am a believer in taxation for the public good. I'm a believer in paying for things, and then having government kind of show you the results of that. So there's a small part of me, I'm just puzzling this through, but there's a small part of me that's like, well, this is an opportunity to say, here's government functioning right here. You pay for something and you get something back if it is indeed a clean toilet and a good experience. I don't think you need the 5 cents every time someone goes to the toilet in order to find the money to make toilets clean and accessible and so forth. But there is a little bit of that dynamic here. It is an opportunity to really show to folks, and as we've been saying, like folks of all stripes, this is what government services do. This is what you pay for. I don't know if that's an argument for actually paid toilets, but like you go to Europe and you're like, oh yeah, it's really clean. And that 5 cents was worth it. And maybe that starts you thinking about all the other ways that like you contribute to government and government gives you something back.
I mean, there is something to be said about, I don't know, if you've ever had to go to a rest stop and you're like, oh, it's so gross in here. Like there's something also about free that implies that it's not going to be well maintained or cared for. And I do think that that's another sort of wrinkle in this, because like we should all have access to bathrooms, yes, but part of having access to bathrooms, an extension of that hygiene, is having a clean bathroom to go to that's not either clogged up or gross or so gross that you actually don't want to go to the bathroom. Like I've been in places where I'm just like, I'd rather go up against a tree. Like I'd rather not be in this space. And so I do think if there's a devil's advocate to play or if there's pushback, there's also something to be said about how we maintain these places or pay and employ people to help maintain these places as part of that tax.
Right, because I think the bigger story here, and this I think does lead us into the modern conversations, is that this movement is happening at the very moment that the disinvestment in cities is coming of age. And so you don't have a big public backstop when you take away these paid toilets. What you have is increased white flight and, these cities going bankrupt. And so you don't get that. And so what you get instead is the privatization of public toilets, which is to say that they're in department stores and
restaurants,
gas stations, restaurants, and Starbucks. And it is interesting that Starbucks in particular, I think, has really stood in the public conversation as the place where you have quote unquote public toilets that are actually private. And the idea of having,
and it shows how low our standards and expectations have dropped. Right.
Yeah.
How low our expectations are, but also how we have outsourced public works. And the way that, Starbucks had billed itself as the third place. And so it provides these free bathrooms because it's doing this work of being a private company that fills in where the disinvestment from public spaces has left a gap. And now we're at the point where, it's no fun to sit in a Starbucks because they've all just turned into mobile ordering pickup places. And they've taken out most of the tables. But now that they're charging for the bathrooms. And in fact, like if you have to buy something in order to use a Starbucks bathroom, you wish you just had to pay a quarter or a dollar.
Right.
Because it's going to be a lot more expensive than that.
But I think that's the main thing, is that the public bathroom has become a kind of tip of the spear in terms of people's understanding of public works. And it's like the cycle you described is completely right. But, in the end, I don't blame someone being like, gosh, if my government can't even keep a bathroom clean, what can they do? So it cuts both ways. But I mean, NIki, to your point about the privatization of it, I mean, in New York, that is a huge dynamic in New York, is where to go to the bathroom. To the point where, when I first moved to New York, I feel like I got tips. Like it was like a big sort of oral history kind of sub rosa thing, was to talk about the places where you could go to the bathrooms. I mean, I was told, and I'm a white guy, that helps, but I was told one of the best reasons to dress decently in New York City is that you can walk into any hotel and just go to the bathroom, right? And no one's going to stop you. And there's even a very popular app and a map that shows like all the bathrooms that you can use. And then moreover, there's like one public bathroom in Bryant Park that is impeccably kept. And it's like,
I know that bathroom.
It's like a legend. Like people talk about it as if it's like, because it's the one. It's really nice.
It's possible.
It's really nice. It's possible. But like, but like people bring it up over and over and over as if it's like this unicorn. And it's like, no, it's just like a well-maintained public bathroom. Like that should be the norm.
Is a unicorn.
Which is
I know.
But it is kind of remarkable how much this ground has been ceded.
I think that's absolutely true. And I had the same experience. I was at a conference in New York, and as long as I looked nice, I could go into the Hilton or Marriott or wherever and just sort of use the restroom, and nobody gives you any flack for it. But I also think it's a big issue for the unhoused. I mean, like,
of course,
bathrooms, especially in urban environments, become sometimes safe spaces from cold weather, sometimes spaces where people are trying to not just take a restroom break, but a general break from the elements, and becomes a real issue.
And what's so fascinating is that, like, all of these problems with public restrooms and private public restrooms, including, I think, that a lot of people get really angry at unhoused people for taking up that space or for compromising the experience of public bathrooms. Well, that's another problem of public disinvestment.
Right.
Yeah.
That's
like,
just
if we actually provided for unhoused people, then it wouldn't be an issue.
Yeah.
But that's not where the blame usually lies.
No.
Any final thoughts here? I mean, as we started with, the bathroom continues to be a very contested space. I mean, is it just inevitable that this will always be a place in which some of the other sort of anxieties and fractures in society are going to be played out because of all the kind of things that we described? It's been so fundamental to our experience.
I think so, because it's so tied to a basic need, and it has been now so tied in the public imagination with vulnerability. And that just gives those conversations about bathrooms a real supercharged dynamic that, especially in this political atmosphere, plays particularly well. So I think we will be fighting about bathrooms for a long time to come.
For sure.
Yeah. All right. Well, we will end it there, but we will be talking about bathrooms as well for a long time to come on this show. There's a few other wrinkles and rabbit holes that we didn't get to in this episode, including in the 1960s, there were the Chicago shit-ins protests that were sort of using bathrooms to do important civil rights work, and we want to return to that as a story. So we will, not just because it's a good pun, but because it actually had an effect. But we will leave that there. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.